It's always a big deal when one of the major gaming players releases new hardware. After all, it's not something we see every day. Yet, I feel like this has been one of the weirdest launches ever, and for good reason. Every time I look at the PlayStation Portal, my reaction is the same as when I see myself in the mirror. Who's this for? Just in case you've never heard of the PlayStation Portal, this is Sony's foray into the streaming handheld market, one that hasn't exactly seen its best days yet. In a nutshell, this is a remote player for your PlayStation 5, and only for your PlayStation 5, whereas the other players in the market such as the Logitech G Cloud can play games from a wide variety of services, the Portal can only stream from a PS5. Your PS5. It's a baffling concept really, especially considering that Sony has its own game streaming service called PlayStation Now. Normally you depend on just your mobile internet connection, but here you're also tied to whatever you've got at home. This can have benefits as I'll get into later, but because you're remotely controlling your PS5, it can also lead to some odd situations. For example, my console is connected to the TV via an amp, and all of the devices talk to each other using CEC or Consumer Electronic Control, meaning if I turn on my PS5, so will the amp and the TV. Every other connected device does the same thing, which is fantastic and has been around forever. Why am I talking about this, you may ask? Well, you see, the PlayStation Portal turns on everything as well, even if I'm not at home. So if you are hundreds of thousands of miles away, once you establish a connection, your TV and amp will turn on, and just like a haunted house, will display whatever you're doing from wherever you're doing it from. You also can't change any of your TV settings remotely, so I hope you turned down the volume before you left, otherwise you're gonna return to some angry neighbors. Just a second, sorry for the interruption, editing cheese here. This was actually fixed in the latest update. Neither the amp nor the TV turn on anymore when you remotely connect to your PS5, so sorry about that outdated information. Let's continue with our scheduled programming. Now, in defense of the Portal, this is technically caused by the PlayStation 5 and how it handles remote play. The Portal has little to no say in this. Of course, I could just disable CST, but then I would lose something I had for years. And it's also weird because the PlayStation 4, if I recall correctly, didn't have this issue, but it isn't the only part about the Portal that works in mysterious ways. But before we continue on that front, let's look at the hardware first. From the outside, this looks as if they just jammed an 8-inch 1080p screen in between an existing DualSense controller, and that's pretty much what they did. But once you pick the Portal up for the first time, you'll quickly notice that it's not exactly the same. The most apparent differences are the smaller but taller sticks and slightly different grips. It's barely noticeable, but the original ones are slightly more angled. The D-pad face buttons, mute switch and PlayStation buttons are all the same. Compared to my DualSense, they might be a little bit clickier, but then again, this might just be the result of the controller having been used. The same goes for the triggers, they feel identical, including the adaptive feedback, but on the Portal I could swear that the texture is a tiny bit more grippy. But more importantly, ergonomically speaking, it is probably one of the best feeling handhelds out there. If you love the DualSense, you're gonna love this. Obviously, it is a bit wider, but if you're coming from a Steam Deck or Switch, this slightly more girthy handling shouldn't be all that new. Moving on to the top, we meet our first exclusive buttons for obvious reasons. There is power, a volume rocker, and a PlayStation Link button to connect to the, unfortunately, only wireless audio option available. That is Sony's two new Pulse headsets, which is a real bummer. I understand the latency argument, but it also feels like one of those fine print moments, so keep this in mind. I do think the Portal is priced pretty competitively at $199, but if you had any of the new headsets, you're quickly looking at almost to exactly double the price. In their defense, the Pulse Elite and Pulse Explore headsets look very promising, and coming on the heels of Sony's recent acquisition of Audeze, a high-end headphones company that launched the very popular Maxwell gaming headset just this year, I wonder if any of those features made it over. For example, the new PlayStation Link might just be the same lossless connection that Audeze has been using. The same goes for the Elite headset. Spec-wise, they look very similar, including the planar magnetic drivers, and at $150 versus $399, it might actually be a good deal for anyone that doesn't have a headset yet. For those who do, which I assume is most, me included, Bluetooth would have been nice, even if it is slower. Alternatively, there is an inconveniently placed 3.5mm audio jack on the bottom, but without the connectors we know from the DualSense. Hooking up the Maxwells like this worked just fine, including the microphone, but just in case there are also built-in ones like on the original that can be used in a pinch. If you don't want to shell out extra cash for the private auditorium and want to include your surroundings in your gaming session, you're gonna have a much easier time because not only does the Portal get surprisingly loud, the speakers are also located at the top and fire directly at whomever is sitting opposite of you. They sound spacious but a little thin, and there are far better mobile audio experiences on the market, which makes the whole Bluetooth thing even more questionable. Moving on, at the bottom you'll also find an equally hard to reach single USB-C port that is solely used for charging at 15 watts and no more, sadly. It took me just a little over 2 hours to get from 0 to 100% and lasted for about 4 to 5 hours, which is okay. It's a lot more than what you would get from a device that has to do all the processing by itself, but that being said, I thought it would do better exactly because of this. It is very thin and light though, at around 520 grams. The touchscreen is a bit weird though. It replaces the touchpad found on the DualSense, but in a less than ideal way. Whereas the controller has a physical button underneath it, here you have to do a double tap to activate it, which does take a little time to get used to. It can also be used to input Wi-Fi passwords and some of the on-screen menu items. So it is a genuine touchscreen, but weirdly enough, if you're in the store for example, you can't use it to input search terms. The microphone in contrast does work through the Portal, but not the touchscreen. Basically, once you start streaming, it becomes the DualSense touchpad and no more. While we're at it, let's take a look at this centerpiece. This is the 8-inch 60Hz 1920 by 1080 IPS display. I love the size. The bezels are also super small, which is a big plus in my books, and the games genuinely look fantastic. I was really surprised at how many details I was able to still make out and how clear the picture is when the connection is good, but more about that in a minute because this depends on several factors. Sometimes, especially at home, you can forget that you're streaming and maybe get a little glimpse of what the future of handheld gaming could look like, at least visually speaking. The screen isn't perfect though, it is still an IPS display, so we don't get the kind of contrast and black levels we find on an OLED. Another missing feature is the lack of HDR, which I think is a real oversight on Sony's part. But it's time to go to the actual gaming experience, because none of the hardware prowess is going to help you if you can't actually play. At home, the Portal works just fine, the streaming quality is great, but I did occasionally get some hiccups. This was to some degree resolved by using a wired connection for the PS5 instead of Wi-Fi, and is also something that Sony recommends, even if you've got a pretty good coverage at home, which I think I do. Outside though, it is a bit of a different story. You can connect a Portal to any Wi-Fi and stream remotely as long as they don't require a browser to authenticate, like in a hotel, coffee shop, or maybe one of those trains, or dare I say it, airplane. That is because the Portal does not have a browser for you to sign over your soul by accepting the terms and conditions of whatever business you're bending over to, which is another feature that just seems questionably missing, but most modern phones have a hotspot feature and using that works kinda okay. Not great, but okay. This doesn't only depend on your mobile connection though, you are also relying on the bandwidth you have at home because remember, you are streaming from your PS5. Now, whether or not this is going to work well heavily depends on a lot of factors, from your home connection to your carrier and current reception, as well as everything in between, including country, area, and any possible interferences. If just one of those has a bad day, you are probably going to have a bad day. For me, it never really worked that well, at least not good enough that I would consider taking the Portal with me on trips. I had interruptions, dropped connections, and lower streaming quality all the time. There is also a noticeable bump in input delay. For anything that requires timely button presses, I'd avoid it. Once again, in defense of the Portal, I don't think it was ever intended to be used like this. The fact that we can play outside of our homes is kind of a bonus. Sony is primarily targeting this as a second or alternative screen, and they're actually pretty clear about this. But it is inevitable that many of us will ignore that and do it anyway, because we can, which is kinda cool and actually does have some benefits. For example, these days almost every time I turn on a system, I feel like I'm getting barraged with update after update. If you got limited bandwidth or data package while being abroad, you might run out of time and space even before you get a chance to get started. This isn't an issue with the Portal because remember, this is your home PS5 doing all the heavy lifting, so game updates might be less of an issue, that is unless it is a system update. I actually ran into this once. I wasn't at home and wanted to get a quick session in, but just couldn't figure out why it suddenly wouldn't connect anymore. Once I got back though, I was greeted with the familiar PS5 update screen, at which point I realized, ah yes, that piece of shit. I do believe that if you have a PlayStation Plus subscription, you might not run into this issue, if you have automatic updates enabled. Otherwise, you're gonna be locked out, and if this is the only entertainment you brought with you, my condolences. Again, it was never intended to be used away from your home, but even in your local network, there are still some issues. For example, on mobile devices like a Switch that run games locally, you can always instantly suspend your session and pick it up later, but what do you think happens when you hit the power button on the Portal? Well, because the PS5's HDMI signal is always active, as we learned earlier, we can actually observe that ourselves. For example, let's say you got your Diablo 4 session going, but suddenly realize that you're late for that very important colonoscopy. You hit the power button and run towards your cavity inspection. But unlike your doctor whose heart just stopped upon witnessing the canals, the PS5 continues to do business as usual. The same also happens when you lose the connection. The game just keeps on running as if nothing happened. This can lead to some annoying situations of sudden death. Why the PS5 doesn't go to pause or suspend is once again baffling to me. I also don't think this is a home or not at home issue either. This would have been handy regardless, but there's more. For example, when you charge the Portal, you get no indication other than the battery icon when you turn it on. On the DualSense, you get those pulsating orange lights. I don't know why the Portal doesn't do this, but it would have been nice if it did. Or the fact that you can't use it as a regular controller. I'm not talking about a second screen, I mean just as a controller. This would be a great secondary usage and would make me recommend this to anyone who maybe just needs more pads and wouldn't mind the extra cost for some extra features. While we're on the topic of second screen, let's do some wishful thinking. I think one of the biggest challenges the Wii U faced was that the second screen required a lot of additional effort to be fully utilized. Not every studio could afford it, and even when they did, the payoff wasn't worth it because people didn't flock to the Wii U versions to get those extra experiences. For the Portal though, there could be features that are in Sony's hands. For example, remember Game Help? I know, I don't use it either, but this could be added via first-party implementation, if present, and then be additionally displayed on the Portal. Or a social screen, live stream info, chats, heck, just give me Spotify's currently playing a song. That alone would make me smile from cheek to cheek. By the way, I didn't talk about any of this, but you can't stream any media from your PS5 either. Just games. Not that that use case makes much sense. There seems to be so much the Portal could do, but so little it actually does. But when it does, when everything works, it's actually really fun. It's a great accessory when you just want to play PS5. I know Remote Play has been around for years, you can try it out right now. If you have a PS5, it'll most likely run on your phone, PC or Mac. Just pair a DualSense and get going. But for the lazy kind, which unfortunately I am one of, having a dedicated device to just do this is sometimes preferable. I have it with me on my desk when I work from home, and during breaks or even between YouTube editing sessions, being able to drive around a few tracks in Gran Turismo is really relaxing, and being able to just pick it up is something I start to really appreciate. But there's no beating around the bush. It is a luxury item that only very few people actually need. If you are on the verge of buying one of these, really think about how you intend to use it. If you want something portable to play games, there are a lot of better options out there, cheaper ones too, depending on what kind of games you want to play. The good thing here is that this is one of those very rare occasions where you can try out almost the exact experience right now. Assuming you already own a PS5, give it a go, at home, away, or everywhere you intend to use the Portal. It's not going to be exactly the same, and honestly sometimes it worked better, sometimes worse, for no apparent reason. But it will give you an idea of how it feels like, and if you already hate it, this isn't going to make it better. However, if you do like it, and if the PlayStation 5 is your chosen drug, including all the limitations, well, then maybe this is the Portal you should be stepping into. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I wonder, how do you feel about the PlayStation Portal? Any plans on getting this or putting it under a certain tree during a certain evening? I'm really curious to hear what you think, or what you thought of the video. Any good or terrible as usual? Anyway, I think by the time this goes up, it'll be just around the holidays, so happy celebrating, or whatever you are doing. I hope you enjoy it and that you get some peace during this time of the year. There's one more before the year ends, which you voted on, so see you very soon in the next one. Bye!